On December 2nd, 2025, the world expected nothing more than another documentary drop on Netflix. After all, Sean Diddy Combs had already been serving a 50-month prison sentence for charges that had shattered his public image. And most of his partnerships had dissolved long before he stepped into the prison yard. For many, his fall from grace felt complete, but when The Reckoning premiered, viewers quickly realized it wasn't just another retelling of events. They were watching the beginning of an aftershock that would shake everything that was left standing. Despite being behind bars for the past 14 months, Diddy's shadow still loomed large over music, culture, and business. Some believed his story was over. Others insisted that the truth had barely started to surface. But within the first 10 minutes of the documentary, a jolt hit the public consciousness so hard that even prison walls couldn't contain it. The revelations presented on screen hinted at buried chapters, hidden motives, and patterns that had escaped scrutiny for decades. In living rooms, coffee shops, break rooms, and on subway platforms, viewers leaned forward as the documentary walked them through a maze of testimonies, timelines, and never-before-seen accounts. Social media ignited instantly. Hashtags trended worldwide. Commentators who had once declared Diddy finished found themselves reevaluating everything. This wasn't the story people thought they knew. It was the story beneath that story. Even in prison, the impact reached him faster than expected. Guards whispered. Other inmates stared. A counselor paused after saying his name during roll call. The facility buzzed with rumors, as if the documentary had opened a wound that was still bleeding under the surface. Meanwhile, outside those walls, prosecutors watched the documentary with sharpened attention. Many of the institutions that had already turned away from Diddy now questioned whether they had understood the full picture. Archived files were reopened. Old interviews were re-examined. A few investigators admitted quietly that the documentary raised questions they had never considered asking. For years, Diddy's influence had helped shield him from deeper scrutiny. But this time, there was no shield, no PR team, no boardroom meeting, just the cold, unfiltered reaction of a world seeing new layers unfold on screen. By evening, the shockwave evolved into a global conversation. Some viewers felt vindicated, others were stunned silent. But nearly everyone agreed on one thing. The Reckoning had done more than revisit a fallen star. It had revealed the tremors that hinted at an even larger collapse. And as the night stretched on, a single question echoed everywhere. If this was only the beginning of the documentary, what would the rest expose? When the sun rose on December 3rd, 2025, the world was already digesting the first shockwave of the Reckoning, but the real consequences began unfolding in the quiet corners of a world that had once revolved around Sean Diddy Combs. Even though he had been locked away for more than a year and most corporate partners had abandoned him long ago, the documentary brought something far more damaging. Renewed scrutiny and renewed fear. His empire wasn't just declining anymore. Now it was collapsing with speed. Inside the stripped-down offices of what once was Bad Boy Entertainment, the atmosphere felt heavier than it had the day Diddy was sentenced. A handful of remaining staff members scrolled through messages from artists, managers, and collaborators demanding immediate removal of their names from any lingering association. Even those who had previously defended him could no longer ignore the storm building outside. "This is different," one executive murmured. "This feels like the end of the whole thing." Labels that had quietly maintained distribution agreements began issuing sudden termination notices. Sponsors that had kept low-profile contracts hanging by a thread finally cut them clean. A few independent artists who had stayed loyal out of personal respect released statements expressing shock, distancing themselves in ways that were both swift and public. The documentary didn't just remind the world of his fall, it forced everyone connected to him to reevaluate the risk of staying close to a sinking ship. Financial cracks widened faster than anyone anticipated. Residual revenue streams dried up as platforms took down promotional materials. Playlists shifted, and licensing partners backed away. Managers called emergency meetings to discuss the survival of the label without its founder. Some argued that Bad Boy could restructure and move forward. Others believed that the brand itself had become too toxic, too tied to the man who now sat behind bars while the world unraveled around him. Meanwhile, inside the prison, news moved faster than the guards could manage. Fellow inmates whispered about the documentary, their reactions swinging between shock and amusement. Diddy's name echoed through the hallways in a way it hadn't in months, not with admiration, but with the heavy weight of a legacy crumbling in real time. Even staff members at the facility kept glancing at their phones, tracking a public meltdown that seemed both inevitable and unbelievable. For years, Diddy's empire had relied on image, influence, and the belief that he was untouchable. Now each of those pillars was cracking at the same time. The documentary had not only reopened old wounds, it had exposed the fractures beneath the surface that nobody had seen, or perhaps nobody had dared to acknowledge. By that evening, one thing was clear. The empire wasn't just weakening, it was breaking apart piece by piece, with no one left to hold it together. And deeper inside the storyline, something even more consequential was stirring, because the world was about to focus on the man who helped spark the entire unraveling. While the world dissected the fallout of the reckoning, a single question rose to the surface. Why now? And why so deeply? The answer, at least in the public eye, pointed to one man, Curtis 50 Cent Jackson. In the days following the documentary's release, his name trended almost as heavily as Diddy's. People replayed his interviews, searched for old feuds, and tried to understand whether the documentary was a strategic masterstroke, an act of justice, or simply the final chapter of a rivalry that had spanned decades. But what the public didn't see was the quiet preparation that had taken place long before December 2nd, 2025. 50 Cent had anticipated backlash, noise, and speculation. What he hadn't expected was the sheer magnitude of the response. Overnight, his phone lit up with messages from journalists, lawyers, former industry insiders, and even individuals whose names had never surfaced in public before. Some reached out to thank him. Others reached out of fear. A few simply wanted to talk. And in all of it, 50 realized that his decision to produce the documentary had opened a door that could no longer be closed. Still, he stayed silent during those first few days. His team urged him to issue a statement, but he refused. "Let the documentary speak first," he told them. And it did, louder than he expected. Behind the scenes, however, he began studying the reactions coming from the legal community. Prosecutors appeared unusually attentive. Investigators were picking apart timelines, reviewing statements, and comparing reports with portions of the documentary that hinted at deeper issues. Something was shifting, and 50 Cent could feel it. The ground under Diddy's already fractured reputation was beginning to move again. One afternoon, he met privately with his production team in a small studio office tucked away in Manhattan. A wall of digital screens showed social media feeds and news clips, each one capturing a different corner of the global reaction. 50 listened quietly as his team discussed the next steps: follow-up interviews, supplemental content, an extended director's cut. But he was thinking bigger. "This isn't about a show anymore," he finally said. "It's about what happens next." The room went silent. For years, people had dismissed his warnings about the industry's hidden truths. They called him petty, vindictive, obsessed with old rivalries. But the documentary had changed the conversation. And now, with prosecutors probing deeper and former insiders stepping out of the shadows, the narrative was no longer about a feud. It was about accountability. Still, 50 Cent knew that pushing forward would carry consequences. If the documentary triggered a new wave of legal action, he would stand at the center of a cultural earthquake. Critics would accuse him of agenda-driven storytelling. Supporters would hail him as fearless. But he had made peace with that long before the cameras started rolling. By the end of the week, he released a single statement: calm, measured, and deliberate. "Truth has a way of finding daylight. Whatever comes next isn't about me. It's about what people choose to do with what they've seen." It was the counter move that set the stage for the next chapter. The chapter where the world would decide whether Diddy's past would simply remain inside a documentary or be dragged straight into the courtroom. The week after The Reckoning premiered, the conversation shifted from shock and speculation to something far more serious. Prosecutors who had once assumed the Diddy saga was winding down now found themselves staring at screens filled with timelines, interviews, and testimonies that raised new questions. Questions too loud to ignore. It began quietly. A small team inside the district attorney's office held a closed-door meeting, reviewing portions of the documentary with meticulous attention. Reports were compared, files were pulled from storage. A few investigators were reassigned. No one outside that room knew that the quiet stirring had begun, but by the next morning, the first tremor reached the press. Authorities reviewing new materials related to Sean Combs' case. It was just one headline, but it set everything in motion. Inside the prison, Diddy learned of the investigation during his daily check-in. The guard delivered the news with an unreadable expression. "They're looking at your case again," he said, sliding a folded newspaper across the desk. Diddy stared at the headline, his expression tightening. He had gone from a 50-month sentence to the possibility of something far worse, all because of a documentary released when he was already behind bars. His legal team scrambled into action. Emergency calls were made. Strategies were drafted. Statements were prepared. But the momentum outside the prison was no longer in their control. A week later, the courthouse was surrounded by reporters. Cameras were positioned at every entrance. Commentators filled broadcast panels with theories and predictions. The moment prosecutors announced a formal review, the public treated it like a national event. Some arrived to support Diddy, others showed up to demand justice. The air buzzed with tension long before proceedings even began. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. Attorneys on both sides sat surrounded by files and laptops, their expressions sharp and focused. Every seat in the gallery was taken. The judge entered, and silence swept the room like a wave. What followed was a legal battle unlike anything the public had anticipated. Prosecutors introduced new testimony inspired by the documentary. They referenced inconsistencies, re-examined old statements, and presented evidence that had never been connected before. Each piece on its own might have seemed minor, but together they painted a picture the court could no longer dismiss. Diddy's lawyers fought fiercely. They argued that the documentary had influenced public perception unfairly, that opportunists were emerging from the shadows, and that the new wave of testimonies should be viewed with skepticism. But the courtroom's energy had shifted. The judge listened, but the weight of the material introduced was undeniable. Outside, the world waited. Every update sparked fresh debates across social platforms. Commentators questioned whether this case was about justice, legacy, or retribution. Supporters clung to hope. Critics demanded accountability. And through it all, the sense grew that the courtroom's decision would echo far beyond its walls. By the end of the second week, one thing had become unmistakably clear. This wasn't a review anymore. It was a reckoning of its own. And the path ahead was pointing toward a sentence that would change everything. The final day of hearings arrived under gray skies, as if the weather itself sensed what the courtroom was preparing to deliver. For nearly a month, testimony had poured in. Old statements re-examined under new light, witnesses who had been silent for years stepping forward, and patterns that prosecutors argued could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or rumor. What began as a review now looked unmistakably like a full-scale legal overhaul of Diddy's remaining charges. The courtroom was silent when the judge entered. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but dozens of artists, journalists, and former industry associates filled every seat. Outside, a crowd stretched around the block, some holding signs of support, others calling for accountability. The air felt divided, heavy, wound tight with expectation. Diddy sat beside his attorneys, his posture rigid. Even after 14 months behind bars, he carried himself with the same guarded composure he had worn his entire career. But beneath the calm surface was an unmistakable tension. A man who knew the stakes had risen far beyond the 50-month sentence he was already serving. The judge began reading through the summary of the proceedings, outlining the re-examined materials, the supplemental testimonies, and the court's determination that the new details had shifted the legal landscape. The room seemed to shrink with each passing word. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The judge paused, lifted her eyes, and delivered the decision with a gravity that froze the entire room. Sean Combs, based on the findings presented during this hearing and the court's determination that the newly substantiated evidence significantly alters the nature of your prior sentencing, your term is hereby increased to life imprisonment. Gasps broke through the silence. A woman in the back row covered her mouth. Someone else whispered, "Oh my God!" The sound spread in waves: shock, disbelief, relief, anger. each reaction colliding with the next. Diddy remained still. His eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't speak. His attorneys immediately stood to object, arguing procedural overreach and media influence. But the judge cut them off with a firm ruling. The decision was final, and appeals would need to follow the designated process. For now, the life sentence stood. Outside the courthouse, chaos erupted. News outlets broke the headline within seconds. Sean Combs' sentence increased to life. Supporters collapsed into tears or shouted in frustration. Critics claimed justice had finally arrived. Social media exploded with debates, think pieces, and emotional reactions. For people who had grown up watching Diddy's rise, the ruling felt surreal, a moment too monumental to process in real time. In the midst of the frenzy, 50 Cent's name began trending again. Reporters speculated about his role in the chain of events, while commentators argued whether the reckoning had merely revealed the truth or triggered a new era of celebrity accountability. But 50 himself stayed silent, watching events unfold from afar, knowing this outcome would ignite discussions for years. Back in the courtroom, Diddy was led away in handcuffs, his silhouette passing through a doorway that marked a permanent shift in his life. No cameras captured the moment, but those who witnessed it said the same thing. It felt like the end of an era, one that had burned bright, burned long, and ultimately consumed itself. And beyond the courthouse doors, the world braced for the aftermath. In the days that followed the life sentence ruling, the world felt strangely divided, caught somewhere between the end of a long chapter and the beginning of an uncertain new era. The courthouse that had overflowed with tension now stood quiet, but the impact of the verdict rippled far beyond its stone steps. For the first time in decades, an entire industry began reevaluating the systems, loyalties, and silences that had shaped it. News outlets filled their broadcasts with round-the-clock coverage. Analysts dissected the legal timeline, celebrity historians traced Diddy's rise and downfall, and commentators argued about what the reckoning had meant for public perception. Some insisted the documentary had simply revealed what authorities had missed. Others argued it forced society to confront hard questions long ignored. But regardless of the perspective, one fact remained: the world wasn't looking away anymore. Inside the prison, word of the life sentence spread quickly. Fellow inmates watched Diddy with a mix of curiosity and caution. Once known for his swagger and influence, he now moved with a quietness that hinted at deep contemplation. Some said he spent hours pacing in his cell. Others claimed he sat staring at the small window, absorbing the reality that the life he'd built outside no longer belonged to him. What remained of his empire dissolved rapidly. Employees who had stayed through the earlier scandals resigned. Buildings once filled with music and ambition closed their doors. The bad boy logo, once iconic, became a symbol of what happens when power goes unchecked. Even his most dedicated supporters found themselves forced to confront a story they no longer recognized. Meanwhile, 50 Cent observed the aftermath from a distance. He didn't celebrate or boast. He didn't release statements or victory videos. Instead, he met with his team behind closed doors, reviewing footage, discussing impact, and debating the ethical weight of everything that had unfolded since the documentary's release. Despite being the creator of The Reckoning, even he seemed surprised by the chain reaction it had set in motion. People close to him said he understood something the public hadn't. Truth, once unleashed, does not move in straight lines. It ricochets, it accelerates, it lands in places no one expects. And now that truth had rewritten the legacy of one of the most powerful figures in modern music. But the world didn't stop to catch its breath. Other artists, executives, and industry veterans stepped forward to tell their own stories. Conversations about accountability, power, and systemic protection spread across social networks, boardrooms, and creative spaces. Younger artists asked new questions. Older ones reflected on old scars. A cultural shift, subtle at first, began to take root. And yet, beneath the noise, a quiet understanding settled in. This wasn't just the end of Diddy's journey. It was the beginning of a new lens through which the world viewed fame, influence, and the cost of silence. Months later, when the frenzy finally faded and headlines moved on, the reckoning remained. Students studied it, journalists referenced it, creators debated it, And in a small studio office tucked away in New York, 50 Cent watched the final cut again. Not as a producer, but as a man who had witnessed the impossible happen. A documentary had changed a life. And in doing so, it had changed an era.